Ma'am, move to the back of the line. Priority boarding is for actual premium travelers. The words cracked across gate C-27 loud enough to silence the usual airport chatter, and dozens of heads turned at once. Rolling suitcases stopped in place, coffee cups paused halfway to waiting lips, and the steady rhythm of boarding suddenly felt like it had frozen. The woman standing near the priority lane didn't argue. She didn't sigh. She simply lifted her eyes toward the gate agent with the calm expression of someone who had heard those words before. Danielle Brooks, 44 years old, wore a charcoal hoodie, dark blue jeans, clean white sneakers, and carried nothing more than a black leather backpack over one shoulder. There were no designer logos, no expensive jewelry, no assistant standing beside her, and certainly nothing that matched the image many people expected when they imagined the chief executive of a multi-billion-dollar technology company. That was exactly how Danielle preferred it. She had spent years discovering that appearances often revealed more about other people than they ever did about her. The gate agent folded her arms, her customer service smile disappearing behind quiet certainty. Ma'am, you're holding up everyone else. Step aside until your boarding group is called. Danielle glanced down at the digital boarding pass still resting in her hand. The screen clearly displayed priority boarding. She looked back up without raising her voice. I believe I'm in the correct line. A few passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. A businessman in an expensive navy suit frowned before looking away. An elderly couple whispered to each other. A teenage girl wearing headphones quietly lowered her phone, sensing that something wasn't right. The gate agent shook her head as though correcting a child. You can believe whatever you want, but this line isn't for people who just walk up because they think they belong here. The sentence landed harder than the first. It wasn't simply about boarding anymore. It was about judgment. Danielle remained perfectly still. Around her, the bright terminal lights reflected across polished floors while departure. Announcements echoed through the concourse. Flight 482 to Seattle had been scheduled to begin boarding at exactly 8:15 that morning, and everything appeared normal except for the growing tension gathering around gate C-27. Danielle had arrived nearly an hour early after taking a quiet rideshare from downtown. She could have requested private airport assistance. She could have entered through executive services. She could have called half a dozen senior executives whose numbers lived inside her phone. Instead, she chose to experience the airline exactly as every other passenger would. Today wasn't simply another business trip. In less than 3 hours, executives from this airline expected to finalize a strategic partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars with Brooks Dynamics. The company Danielle had built from a 2-person startup into one of America's fastest-growing technology firms. No one at the gate knew that. They saw only a black woman dressed comfortably for travel. They saw someone who didn't fit the picture already formed inside their minds. And as the boarding line stretched farther behind her, Danielle realized this morning was no longer about catching a flight. It had quietly become a test that would reveal exactly what kind of company she was about to trust with her business. Danielle Brooks had learned years ago that the most revealing moments in business rarely happened inside polished boardrooms. They happened in ordinary places where no one believed they were being watched. That was why she traveled alone whenever possible. No executive assistant walked beside her. No security detail cleared a path through crowded terminals. No luxury luggage announced her arrival before she spoke a single word. She believed respect should never depend on a title that appeared beneath a person's name. It should exist long before anyone knew who they were. She adjusted the strap of her backpack and remained exactly where she was. Behind the counter, the gate agent tapped impatiently against the computer keyboard before glancing at another employee standing a few feet away. The younger employee looked toward Danielle and then quietly back at the monitor, uncertain whether something had actually gone wrong or whether everyone was simply following assumptions instead of facts. The boarding scanner remained silent. No error message flashed across the screen. Nothing suggested Danielle lacked permission to stand exactly where she was. Even so, the atmosphere continued to tighten. Several passengers who had been waiting in the standard boarding lane now watched with open curiosity instead of impatience. A father traveling with 2 young children leaned over and whispered, "She has not even raised her voice." His wife nodded slowly. "That is what makes this feel uncomfortable." Danielle heard neither comment. Her attention stayed fixed on the gate area, where every small decision revealed something larger. 23 years earlier, she had stood inside another airport wearing her first business suit after graduating from college. She remembered carefully printing her itinerary, checking every document twice, and saving for months to afford her first business class ticket. A gate employee had looked at her boarding pass, smiled politely, and asked if she was certain she belonged in the correct boarding group. Another passenger had stepped forward without being questioned at all. Danielle had boarded that flight, but she never forgot the feeling of realizing that credentials alone did not always erase assumptions. She had promised herself that if success ever found her, she would never allow power to separate her from everyday experiences. Success had certainly arrived. Brooks Dynamics now employed thousands of people across the United States and maintained partnerships with companies around the world. Yet Danielle still preferred airport coffee over private lounges and regular boarding gates over private terminals, because truth lived where policies met people. She reached into her backpack and removed a small notebook, flipping through handwritten meeting notes for the afternoon. The partnership scheduled for 11 o'clock represented more than revenue. Her company planned to integrate advanced passenger technology that would improve accessibility, shorten boarding times, and simplify travel for millions of customers. Danielle had personally insisted on meeting the airline leadership face-to-face before signing the final agreement. Trust, she believed, could never be measured only by financial reports. It had to be earned by culture. A sharp voice interrupted her thoughts. "Is there still a problem over here?" A woman wearing a supervisor badge approached the counter with confident steps, her expression already shaped by the assumption that someone had caused unnecessary trouble. The gate agent pointed directly toward Danielle before answering. "She keeps insisting she belongs in priority boarding." The supervisor looked Danielle up and down for only a moment before speaking. "Then let us clear this up quickly." Danielle closed her notebook with quiet precision. Without realizing it, everyone standing near gate C27 had stopped watching the departure board. They were watching the people instead. The supervisor stopped a few feet in front of Danielle Brooks and offered a smile that never reached her eyes. Her name tag read Karen Mitchell, and the confidence in her posture suggested she had already decided how this conversation would end. "Good morning," she said in a measured tone. "I understand there is some confusion about the boarding process." Danielle handed over her digital boarding pass without hesitation. "There should not be any confusion." Karen glanced at the screen for barely a second before lowering it again. "Sometimes passengers accidentally enter the wrong boarding lane. It happens every day." Danielle answered calmly. "Then perhaps you should scan it." Instead of reaching for the scanner, Karen looked toward the gate agent, who gave a subtle nod as though they had silently reached the same conclusion. "There is no need for that just yet," Karen replied. "Please step aside while we board our priority customers." The choice of words hung in the air. "Our priority customers." Danielle slowly folded her phone back into her hand. "My boarding pass identifies me as one of those customers." Karen tilted her head slightly. "Ma'am, I am trying to avoid delaying this flight." Before Danielle could respond, another passenger approached the priority lane. He wore an expensive tailored blazer, carried a polished leather briefcase, and smiled confidently as he walked directly toward the scanner. The gate agent welcomed him without asking a single question. "Right this way, sir. Thank you for flying with us." The scanner chimed instantly, and he disappeared down the jet bridge without ever showing additional identification. Danielle watched the entire exchange without changing her expression. Several people nearby noticed it too. A woman standing beside the charging station quietly frowned. An older veteran wearing a baseball cap looked from Danielle to the departing passenger before slowly shaking his head. Even the younger airline employee behind the counter seemed increasingly uncomfortable as her eyes moved repeatedly toward Danielle's boarding pass. Karen extended one hand toward the waiting area. "Please stand over there until we finish boarding the premium cabin." Danielle remained where she was. "What specifically prevents you from scanning my boarding pass?" Karen hesitated for only a fraction of a second before answering. "I have been doing this for many years. Experience tells me when something does not look right." Danielle met her eyes. Experience should lead to verification, not assumptions. The surrounding conversations grew quieter. People were no longer pretending not to notice. Every sentence echoed more loudly than the departure announcements filling the terminal. A young businessman lowered his laptop. A college student removed one earbud. Even travelers walking toward neighboring gates slowed, as they sensed unusual tension gathering near gate C27. The gate agent folded her arms once more. "You are making this much more difficult than it needs to be," Danielle answered without raising her voice. "No, I am asking you to follow your own procedure." Karen's expression tightened. "If you continue refusing my instructions, I will request additional assistance." Danielle gave a slight nod. "You are free to do that." Silence settled over the gate for several long seconds. No one expected the woman in the charcoal hoodie to sound so composed while standing alone against two airline employees. Across the counter, the younger employee glanced again at the computer screen, then back toward Danielle's boarding pass. Something clearly troubled her, but she remained silent. Meanwhile, several passengers instinctively reached for their phones, not yet recording, simply holding them as though they sensed they were witnessing a moment that was about to become much larger than a delayed boarding line. The silence finally broke from the least expected place. "Excuse me," a quiet voice said from behind the counter. The younger employee stepped forward, her name tag reading Emily Foster. She looked nervous, glancing first at Karen Mitchell and then at Danielle Brooks before speaking again. "I checked her in earlier this morning when she dropped off her bag. Her identification matched her reservation, and her boarding pass scanned correctly." Karen did not even look at her. "Emily, I did not ask for your opinion." Emily swallowed but remained where she stood. "It is not an opinion. I remember her because she thanked every employee she spoke to." The gate agent let out a short laugh. "You are still in training. You do not understand everything that goes into airport security." Danielle watched the exchange without interruption. Emily's voice grew steadier. "I understand that we are supposed to verify information before questioning a passenger." Karen finally turned toward her. "Go back to your station." Emily hesitated for a moment before quietly adding, "Her reservation is completely valid." Those 5 words shifted something in the waiting area. The older veteran who had been watching since the beginning folded his newspaper and spoke just loudly enough for nearby travelers to hear. "Then why has nobody scanned her boarding pass?" No one answered him. A woman traveling with her teenage son exchanged worried looks before taking out her phone. A businessman who had boarded dozens of flights each year slowly shook his head. "This should take 5 seconds," he muttered. "Scan the pass and move on." A young travel blogger standing near the charging station instinctively raised her phone. "This does not seem right," she whispered as she prepared to record. Danielle turned toward her with calm eyes. "Please do not." The young woman looked surprised. "But everyone should see this." Danielle offered a gentle smile. "If we want things to improve, let the truth speak before the cameras do." The phone slowly lowered. Several nearby passengers exchanged glances, surprised that the only person being questioned was also the one trying to keep the situation from becoming a public spectacle. Emily looked at Danielle with quiet admiration. She had expected frustration, perhaps anger, but instead she saw remarkable composure. Karen, however, interpreted the growing attention differently. She crossed her arms once more and addressed the waiting passengers instead of Danielle. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are simply resolving a security concern before continuing boarding." Danielle spoke before anyone else could respond. "There is no security concern. There is only an unanswered question. Why has my boarding pass still not been scanned?" Karen ignored the question entirely. Instead, she reached for the airport phone mounted beneath the counter and pressed a speed dial button. Emily's eyes widened. "What are you doing?" Karen answered without looking up. "Requesting additional airport support." Emily took one careful step closer. "Support for what?" She has followed every instruction except leaving a line she is authorized to use. The gate agent sighed dramatically. "Some passengers create unnecessary disruptions." Danielle remained perfectly still. Standing quietly is not a disruption. The surrounding gate had changed completely. Conversations about vacations, business meetings, and connecting flights had disappeared. Every pair of eyes now rested on the growing circle around the boarding lane. The departure monitor continued flashing the words "now boarding," yet almost no one moved toward the scanner. It was as though the entire gate understood that the real journey had not yet begun. Emily looked once more at the computer screen in front of her, then back at Danielle. The reservation was still there. The priority status had never changed. Every detail matched perfectly. For the first time that morning, Emily realized the issue had never been the boarding pass. It was the person holding it. Karen Mitchell lowered the phone back onto its cradle with deliberate confidence, as though simply requesting additional support had already settled the matter. Airport customer assistance is on the way, she announced. Until they arrive, I need you to step away from the priority boarding lane. Danielle Brooks remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed, her breathing steady. I am standing where my boarding pass authorizes me to stand. Karen took a slow step closer, leaving only a few feet between them. You are making everyone uncomfortable. Danielle looked briefly around the gate. The elderly veteran met her eyes and quietly shook his head. The young family stood silently beside their luggage. Emily Foster remained frozen behind the counter, her hands resting on the keyboard she no longer touched. Danielle answered softly, I do not believe I am the one making people uncomfortable. The words settled over the gate with unexpected weight. Karen reached out, lightly placing a hand against Danielle's forearm as if to guide her toward the waiting area. Please come with me. Danielle calmly eased her arm back without any sudden movement. I prefer not to be touched. Thank you. Emily immediately stepped forward. Karen, she is cooperating. There is no reason to do that. Karen's expression hardened. Emily, enough. Danielle's heartbeat remained steady, but for the briefest moment another airport, another terminal, and another version of herself appeared in her mind. She was 21 years old again, carrying a single garment bag after saving every extra dollar from an internship to attend a national leadership conference. She remembered standing proudly in line with a first-class boarding pass she could barely afford. A gate employee had smiled politely before saying, This line is reserved for our premium travelers. Danielle had quietly held up her boarding pass, believing the misunderstanding would disappear. Instead, she had been asked 3 more times if she was certain she belonged there while other passengers continued boarding without interruption. She had boarded that flight carrying something much heavier than her luggage. She carried the quiet realization that success could open doors while prejudice still tried to close them. That memory had never disappeared. It simply became fuel. Every company she built, every employee she hired, and every leadership principle she embraced had grown from moments exactly like that one. Back in the present, Danielle slowly looked toward the jet bridge entrance where priority passengers continued boarding one after another. None of them had faced a single additional question. None had been asked to prove they belonged. Karen folded her arms again. This would have been over already if you had simply followed instructions. Danielle answered with calm certainty. This would have been over already if my boarding pass had been scanned. A quiet murmur spread through the waiting area. Several passengers nodded almost instinctively. The businessman who had remained silent until then finally spoke. She has a point. The older veteran added. Every minute spent arguing could have been spent verifying. Emily looked from Karen to Danielle before taking a deep breath. I can scan it right now. Karen immediately cut her off. No. The single word echoed louder than expected. Emily blinked. Why not? Karen did not answer. Instead, she looked toward the concourse where 2 airport operations employees had just appeared in the distance, walking steadily toward gate C27 after receiving her request. Danielle watched them approach without the slightest sign of concern. She reached into the pocket of her hoodie and gently unlocked her phone. Her thumb rested above one familiar contact, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because every meaningful partnership eventually reached a moment when values mattered more than contracts. As the operations employees came closer, Danielle quietly whispered to herself, almost too softly for anyone else to hear. Now we discover what this company truly stands for. The 2 airport operations employees arrived at gate C27 with professional expressions that suggested they expected nothing more than a routine customer service issue. One introduced himself as Michael Reynolds, while the other quietly observed the scene without speaking. Michael looked first at Karen Mitchell, then at Danielle Brooks. Can someone explain what happened? Karen answered immediately. This passenger refuses to leave the priority boarding lane after repeated instructions. Michael nodded slowly before turning toward Danielle. Ma'am, I would like to hear your side as well. Danielle held out her phone, displaying the same digital boarding pass that no one had bothered to scan. I presented a valid priority boarding pass several minutes ago. I have simply asked that it be verified. Michael reached toward the scanner. Before his hand could touch it, Karen spoke sharply. That is not necessary. We have already assessed the situation. Emily Foster could no longer remain silent. No, we have not. Nobody has scanned her boarding pass even once. Michael looked back and forth between the two employees. Is that correct? Emily nodded. Yes. Everything in the reservation system matches. I checked her in this morning myself. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on Michael's face. Danielle watched the exchange without interrupting. She understood something important had just changed. The conversation was no longer about her. It was becoming about their own decisions. She unlocked her phone and selected a single contact. The call connected before the second ring ended. Good morning, Rebecca, Danielle said calmly. Her voice remained soft enough that only the people closest to her could hear every word. Please activate partnership review protocol. There was no hesitation on the other end. Understood, Ms. Brooks. I am notifying corporate relations, legal affairs, and the executive partnership office now. Would you like me to alert the airline leadership team as well? Danielle looked toward the boarding gate, where passengers continued watching instead of boarding. Yes. Inform them that the customer experience review has concluded. Rebecca answered with the same composed efficiency she always displayed. Already in progress. You should receive confirmation within a few minutes. Danielle ended the call and quietly slipped her phone back into her pocket. Karen let out a short, dismissive laugh. Calling a lawyer is not going to change airline policy. Danielle looked directly at her. I did not call a lawyer. Michael frowned. Partnership review protocol? Danielle simply replied. It is an internal process. Emily noticed the change in Danielle's expression. It was still calm, but now it carried absolute certainty. Whatever that phone call meant, Danielle had not made it to threaten anyone. She had made it because a decision had already been reached. Around the gate, whispers spread from passenger to passenger. Did she say partnership? One traveler asked quietly. Maybe she works for a vendor, another guessed. The businessman who had spoken earlier folded his boarding pass into his jacket pocket. Whatever her job is, she has stayed more professional than anyone else here. Michael finally picked up the handheld scanner resting beside the counter. Karen immediately stepped between him and Danielle. We have already moved beyond that point. Michael looked genuinely puzzled. Why would verifying her boarding pass be a problem? No one answered him. Emily lowered her eyes for only a second before speaking carefully. Because if it scans correctly, none of this should have happened. The words lingered in the silence like a truth no one at the counter wanted to acknowledge. Danielle remained exactly where she had stood since the beginning of the confrontation, composed, patient, and unshaken, while somewhere beyond the terminal walls a series of executive phone calls had already begun moving toward Gate C-27. The atmosphere at Gate C-27 changed long before anyone important appeared. Phones began vibrating behind the counter. Karen Mitchell glanced at her screen, declined the first call, and immediately received another. Michael Reynolds noticed it too. Karen, you should answer that. She shook her head. I am handling the situation. Seconds later, the gate phone rang. Then the supervisor line. Then another internal extension. Emily Foster stared at the blinking lights in disbelief. She had never seen so many calls arrive within a single minute. Karen finally picked up one receiver with visible irritation. Gate C-27. Her expression slowly shifted. Yes, she is still here. A pause. No, we have not boarded her. Another pause, longer this time. I understand. She placed the receiver down without saying another word. Michael watched her carefully. Who was that? Karen forced a smile that looked increasingly strained. Operations. Danielle Brooks quietly checked the time on her phone. 8:26 in the morning. Right on schedule. Her own phone vibrated once. Rebecca had sent only 6 words. Executive leadership is arriving now. Danielle locked the screen without responding. Across the waiting area, passengers had stopped pretending to be occupied. The businessman who had defended Danielle earlier leaned toward the veteran beside him. Something big is happening. The older man nodded. You can feel it. Emily looked directly at Danielle. Did they call because of you? Danielle answered honestly. They called because of the decisions that were made here. Before anyone could ask another question, hurried footsteps echoed through the concourse. 3 senior airline executives appeared from around the corner, moving far faster than executives normally walked through an airport. Their identification badges hung from Navy suits instead of airport uniforms. Several employees at neighboring gates immediately stepped aside. Karen's confidence disappeared the moment she recognized them. The first executive approached Michael instead of Karen. What exactly happened? Michael answered carefully. A passenger presented a priority boarding pass. It was never scanned. She was repeatedly asked to leave the line. The executive turned toward Karen. Is that accurate? Karen searched for words. There were concerns about. She stopped. For the first time since the confrontation began, she realized every explanation sounded weaker than the facts. Danielle finally stepped forward one pace. Not dramatically, not triumphantly, simply enough to be heard. You asked me to leave the priority line because you decided I did not belong there. No one interrupted. Danielle continued with the same measured voice she had maintained all morning. You never verified my boarding pass. You never questioned the passengers who looked the way you expected. You questioned the one who did not. Complete silence settled across the gate. Danielle looked toward the senior executives. My name is Danielle Brooks. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Brooks Dynamics. Several passengers exchanged stunned looks. Emily covered her mouth with one hand. Karen stood perfectly still. Danielle continued. At 11 o'clock this morning, my leadership team was scheduled to finalize a strategic partnership with your airline worth hundreds of millions of dollars over the next several years. Even the surrounding gates seemed quieter. The executive nearest Danielle lowered his eyes for a brief moment. He already understood what was coming. Danielle looked back toward Karen, not with anger, but with unmistakable disappointment. You asked me to move out of your boarding line. She paused just long enough for every person at gate C27 to absorb the words that followed. I have decided to move my company out of your airline instead. No one spoke. No announcement echoed through the terminal loudly enough to interrupt the silence. Karen's shoulders slowly dropped. Emily looked toward the executives, who now understood that the most expensive decision made that morning had taken less than 5 seconds and had never required a boarding pass to reveal itself. No one at gate C27 moved for several long seconds. The only sound came from the boarding announcement repeating automatically overhead, inviting priority passengers to continue boarding a flight that had suddenly become the least important event in the terminal. The senior executive took one careful step toward Danielle Brooks. Ms. Brooks, he said quietly, I am David Collins, Senior Vice President of Customer Experience. On behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize. Danielle met his eyes without anger. An apology matters when it changes something. David nodded once. It will. He turned toward Michael Reynolds. Effective immediately, suspend boarding at this gate. Several passengers exchanged surprised glances as the boarding scanner was switched off. David continued, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. I want every statement documented before this aircraft departs. Karen Mitchell looked as though she wanted to explain everything at once, but every explanation dissolved before reaching her lips. Facts had replaced assumptions, and facts were impossible to negotiate. David faced her directly. Did you verify Ms. Brooks' boarding credentials? Karen lowered her eyes. No. Did any employee scan her boarding pass before instructing her to leave the priority lane? Silence answered first. Then a quiet voice came from behind the counter. No. Emily Foster replied. It was never scanned. David slowly nodded. Thank you for your honesty. He looked toward another executive standing beside him. Please begin a formal customer experience review effective immediately. The executive opened a tablet and started typing. Karen finally spoke. I believed I was protecting the boarding process. Danielle answered before anyone else could. Policies protect people only when they are applied equally. Another long silence settled over the gate. David turned back toward Karen. Pending the outcome of the investigation, you are relieved from gate operations for the remainder of today. Karen's airport credentials were quietly deactivated through the company system. Her access device emitted a soft electronic tone before its indicator changed color. She stared at it for a moment, realizing that authority disappeared much faster than it had arrived. David then looked toward the gate agent. You are also being removed from active boarding duties until the review is complete. Neither employee argued. Across the waiting area, passengers watched in complete silence. No one celebrated. No one applauded. The moment felt far too significant for that. Emily stood quietly behind the counter, uncertain where to look. David turned toward her instead. Miss Foster, thank you for speaking up when it would have been easier to remain silent. Emily looked surprised. I only said what I knew was true. Danielle offered her a warm smile. That is how real leadership begins. The businessman who had defended Danielle earlier quietly nodded to himself. The veteran folded his newspaper one final time before saying, almost to no one in particular, respect should never require a title. David took a slow breath before facing Danielle once again. I understand your decision regarding the partnership. I also understand why you reached it. Danielle answered with complete sincerity. My company invests in technology, but technology cannot repair a culture that refuses to verify before judging. Rebecca's name appeared once more on Danielle's phone. A short message filled the screen. Partnership cancellation documents have been finalized. Danielle read the message, locked her phone, and slipped it back into her pocket. She did not need to make another dramatic announcement. The decision had already been made. Hundreds of millions of dollars in future collaboration disappeared, not because of one difficult conversation, but because one simple act of fairness had been ignored. Around gate C-27, every employee and every passenger understood the same lesson. The greatest cost that morning had never been measured in contracts. It had been measured in trust, and trust, once lost in public, could not be restored as quickly as a delayed boarding process. The boarding area slowly came back to life, but nothing about it felt the same. Passengers gathered their bags with quieter voices, and even the routine airport announcements seemed distant against the weight of what everyone had just witnessed. David Collins personally walked to the boarding scanner, picked up the handheld device, and looked at Danielle Brooks. "May I?" he asked respectfully. Danielle handed him her phone. For the first time that morning, someone actually verified the information instead of questioning the person. The scanner produced a clear confirmation tone. Priority boarding authorized. David looked down for a brief moment before handing the phone back. It took less than 2 seconds, he said softly. Danielle accepted the device with a gentle smile. It always would have. Emily Foster watched from behind the counter, realizing that the entire confrontation had existed only because one simple step had been ignored. She walked toward Danielle before boarding resumed. "I am sorry for what happened," she said sincerely. Danielle shook her head. "Do not apologize for someone else's choices. Just remember this moment when you have the authority to make your own." Emily nodded, committing every word to memory. She knew that years from now, when she trained new employees or supervised her own team, this morning would still guide every decision she made. Karen quietly collected her personal belongings from behind the counter. She paused briefly, looking toward Danielle as though searching for words that could undo the past hour. None came. Danielle simply offered a respectful nod. It was not forgiveness. It was dignity. Sometimes the greatest consequence was being left alone with the truth. Nearby, the older veteran smiled faintly. "Young lady," he called as Danielle prepared to board. "Thank you for standing your ground without ever raising your voice." Danielle smiled back. Standards rise higher than voices ever can. Several passengers nodded in quiet agreement. The businessman who had spoken earlier extended his hand. "I hope more companies learn from you than lose business because of moments like this." Danielle shook his hand warmly. "That depends on whether people are willing to examine habits they stopped noticing years ago." David stepped forward one final time. "If there is ever an opportunity to earn your trust again, I hope we will deserve the chance." Danielle looked toward the aircraft waiting outside the terminal windows before answering. Trust is never restored by promises. It is restored by consistent actions when nobody important appears to be watching. Those words lingered long after she walked toward the jet bridge. The line moved quietly behind her, but something invisible had shifted. Passengers greeted gate employees more thoughtfully. Employees acknowledged travelers with greater care. Even simple eye contact seemed to carry new meaning. Danielle boarded the aircraft exactly as her boarding pass had authorized from the beginning, taking her seat without celebration, without triumph, and without another word about contracts or executive titles. Outside the window, the morning sun reflected across the runway, bright enough to remind anyone willing to notice that every new day offered another opportunity to choose fairness over assumption. Hundreds of miles away, Brooks Dynamics would soon begin searching for an airline whose culture matched its values. The canceled partnership would become another business headline for financial analysts, but the people standing at gate C-27 would remember something far more important. They would remember that the woman in the charcoal hoodie had never demanded special treatment. She had only expected equal treatment. She had never revealed her position to gain respect. She had revealed it only after respect had already been denied. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all was one Danielle had carried throughout her entire career. Real power is never proven by making someone move. Real power is revealed by refusing to let your principles move, even when everyone else expects you to.